Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Northwest Florida, and Florida itself, which deal, of course, primarily with the past and all of the wonderful things that have happened to us here. Today we're going to be dealing with the story of a man who is not technically a Pensacolian by any means, but one whose story was basically the origin of what we deal with in talking about Florida. And his name, of course, was Don Juan Ponce de Leon. The De Leon story has its beginnings actually a few years before he appears on the local scene. Because we have to turn, of course, to Spain. And Spain and its history was behind so much of Pensacola's story up to and including the early part of the 19th century. Spain had been occupied by what they called Moorish forces beginning in 711 AD. These people had advanced across the Straits of Gibraltar, had occupied Spain, and had held the seats of government and did so up until the year 1492, the very year on which Columbus set sail on the first of his voyages. In 1492, the combined forces of Castile and Aragon, which had been put together through the marriage of King Ferdinand and his Queen Isabella, set the scene for a total expulsion of the Moors. And as that happened, of course, on the very month that the last of the Moors were expelled, Columbus began his first voyage. Altogether, Columbus made 4 such voyages, and it was on the second one that he was accompanied by a man who had been very successful as a soldier in the field during the Moorish War, and his name, of course, was Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon accompanied Columbus on the second voyage, and in the course of that time, the scene was set for I guess we would call it an invasion, a battle for the island of Puerto Rico. And on that voyage and in the subsequent months, Ponce de Leon helped to lead a force which occupied all of that island. And in the course of this time, he, of course, made many contacts with the Native Americans, some of which were happy, some of which were not. But nonetheless, within a matter of months, the finale had been signed, and Spain controlled Puerto Rico. And the king then made Ponce de Leon the governor of that particular area. And he served in it for about 4 years. And at the end of that time, he was relieved. He went into what I guess we would call retirement. And he was by then a very wealthy man. And at the end of a few months, he was bored. And so he began listening to a lot of the stories which Indians and others told about what had happened in the Caribbean islands and beyond. And there were many fables. The Indians loved to tell stories. And of course, the Indians were very wise. They recognized quickly that the Spaniards were after gold and anything that would help them make money. And so they began to tell stories to anyone who would ask about where the gold was. It wasn't in Puerto Rico, but basically they would say, well, if you went this way or that way, you would find it. And one of the stories dealt with an area that they called the island of Bimini. Bimini was to the west of Puerto Rico. So in his retirement, Ponce de Leon said, well, maybe I would like to try something like that. I've got the money. So he turned to King Ferdinand and asked for a grant, which would allow him to lead a force to occupy Bimini. And if there was wealth to be made, he would, of course, share in it with the crown. And the king agreed. And so in 1512, the grant was made. And the following year, in the early part of April, the force was set forth. There were 3 ships altogether, just like Columbus had, and Ponce de Leon, with about 200 men, set sail. They went across the lower part of the Caribbean and landed early in April the 8th, actually, at about where St. Augustine is today. They went ashore, and what they saw was absolutely magnificent. It was beautiful because this was the time of the local blooming flowers, and since this was a Catholic feast day, Ponce de Leon named this the area La Florida, and consequently the name has stuck. Well, Ponce de Leon set about, he looked around what he saw, and he found nothing of the sort that he was looking for. But the Indians said in that area, said, well, now, what you're looking for isn't here, but you have to go around the entire neck of our peninsula here, and that's where you're going to find the gold. So Ponce ordered his ships. They sailed around the Keys, landed about where Port Charlotte is today. They went ashore, and they did not have a particularly warm welcome from the natives. Well, I guess we could call it warm because they shot at them with their bows and arrows. But nonetheless, this was an opportunity to study. He wasn't finding what he wanted, so Ponce de Leon sailed up and down the coast for about 6 months, looking for this and that and the other. And one thing that he supposedly was looking for was a magic fountain, which the Indians had said was there somewhere, and this was a fountain which, if the waters were drunk in considerable quantities, would stop or reverse the process of aging. And Ponce de Leon by now was in his mid-50s. He'd grown a little bit gray. He had a long beard, and the thought of a rejuvenation, of course, was in his mind. Now, whether that story is true or not, I don't think we want to take that. We want to study it on a stack of Bibles, but nonetheless, that's part of the culture. After 6 months, Ponce de Leon withdrew and went back to Puerto Rico, and again felt that perhaps he had missed something in his search. He recognized by now that basically he had not found an island, he had found a part of a mainland, and he wanted to explore further. So basically, after a few months, he became re-engaged in the government of Puerto Rico because they were having some problems there, and for the next 4 years, he continued that sort of work. In the meantime, a number of other men who they did not have grants or commissions from the king to settle or otherwise take advantage of the local community. Several other men of Spanish origin did visit Florida, went up and down the coast, looked here, looked there, but they found little, of course, that interested them. Then in 1519, while Ponce de Leon is still active in Puerto Rico, another explorer named Hernando Cortez brought a sizable group of men onto the east coast, the east coast of Mexico, marched across the Midlands, conquered the conquered the Aztec leadership in what we now call Mexico City. And as they did that, of course, Spain was now entrenched in Mexico, and in this particular instance, Cortez and his men did find exactly what they were looking for. There were riches, there was wealth, all sorts of things, and as a result of that, future explorers, with one or two exceptions, began to look at Mexico rather than Florida as a place where they would make their fortune. Ponce de Leon was ready to return again in 1521. So once again, he put together a sizable organization, with this time with the intent not just of exploring, but also setting up a colony for Spain, so that he had all of the things. It was a little bit like the story of the future with Don Tristan de Luna. They had all of the manpower, the supplies, and so forth to set up villages for the actual entrenchment of Spain. So this time they made the voyage, went around the Keys, and again came to the Port Charlotte area. And it was here that they went ashore. And now, unfortunately for the Spanish, the Indians remembered their earlier visit, and they were not friendly at all. Nonetheless, Ponce de Leon and his people brought their supplies ashore. They began to build houses, the beginnings of a garrison type settlement, and they had been there just months, and part of this, of course, was now in place. At this point in time, the Indians returned, this time in force, and a battle was fought. Unfortunately for our story, Ponce de Leon was wounded. He was hit in the thigh with an arrow, or by an arrow, and he was seriously wounded. His men then literally carried him away, put him back on board ship, and with the wounding of the leader, it was decided to abandon the attempted settlement there near Port Charlotte. And they did. While Ponce de Leon was placed aboard ship, he was returned to the island where he could get proper medical care, but unfortunately for our story, he died very shortly thereafter, and his name then, and its part of Florida story ends at that point. But we have to credit him with, number one, being the first to come, of giving the area its name, of having provided several legends which people could enjoy in the future, and having made a first attempt at colonization, even though that attempt did not succeed. About the same time, another Spanish explorer named Francisco de Leon came to the area. He landed also around the St. Augustine area, and this man made a journey up north along the Atlantic coast, getting about as far as Cape Hatteras. And they looked around again. He did not find a happy native group there. He was expelled rather rudely, but he determined to come back himself to try colonization shortly thereafter, and he did, and again with unfortunately unfortunately, a story of failure. However, in the course of Leon's work, he made this particular comment: if Spain should ever want to place a colony along the Atlantic coastline, this is probably as good a place as any, because the harbor is good, the background, the area, the geographic area looks promising, and so this was put on the shelf of the Spanish government as a kind of a guidepost. And when we talk later about the story of Don Tristan de Luna, the work of Leon was one of those things that made a point. About the same time, of course, other explorers begin to come into the Florida area. The one who we would follow right closely behind Leon and then closely behind Ponce de Leon was named Pánfilo de Narvaez. And Narvaez came ashore with about 250 men in the early part of 1528, 7 years after Ponce de Leon's departure. Narvaez had two intents. He was thinking about colonization, but he wanted to press north beyond where our friend Ponce de Leon had been, move into what we today would call Georgia. And this is exactly what he did. His men went forward, stayed about 3 months, and they had made arrangements that if they did not succeed, his people were going to come back, and they were to be met on the coast of Florida and taken back to their home base. Well, as it turned out, they did not have success, and the march came back, and indeed they got back to the area about where St. Mark's is today. And it was at that point they were to be met. Only the one problem was the ships did not come. So Narvaez and his supporters put together a series of 5 little boats. You can just imagine what they must have been like, because they were not ship's carpenters. They didn't have the right tools, but they put them together. And on a given August day, they set sail, trying to go back to Puerto Rico. They set sail, were very quickly hit by an August storm, and 4 of the 5 boats sank with the loss of all of the people. 1 boat succeeded in returning to shore, and the men in that vessel were led by a man named, whom we today call Cabeza de Vaca. That was not his true name, but Cabeza was a leader, and Cabeza de Vaca began to lead these men back, marching across North Florida, hoping to reach Mexico by this route. And you can imagine what that must have been like, because as they marched along through this terrible, what was basically a jungle at the time, crossing rivers and streams without proper food, and basically they all was starved to death by the time they got to the Escambia Bay. And there they met a series of Indians who were here on vacation. And these Indians were hospitable to them, helped them restore themselves. And once their visit here was finished, Cabeza and his people pressed forward. But in his own notes, he did the same sort of thing that Leon had done. He said, if the Spanish ever wish to place a colony here on the Gulf, this place, which I will call Oshus, this is the place, of course, where they should come. And Oshus, of course, is where we ultimately settled as Pensacola. Cabeza de Vaca continued his march back through the wilderness. He crossed into what we today call Alabama, and in the course of the next 7 years, he and his men were captured, enslaved. They had just an absolutely awful time. But ultimately, he and one of his survivors reached Mexico City and presented the story of what he had seen. So then, at this point in time, we have in the Spanish archives the story of Leon and a possible place for settlement, of Cabeza de Vaca and Pensacola as a possible site. And this was all recorded there to be used in time when the moment was right. And it was the background of these 2 men, plus, of course, what Ponce de Leon had done, that led the Spanish government into the plans for a set of settlements that would be put forth and literally seal off the entire continent against the wishes for colonization by the French and the British. And of course, all of that brought us to the story of Don Tristan de Luna, which began in the late 1550s. And all of this began, of course, with Ponce de Leon, Cabeza de Vaca, and the others. And that is how the Pensacola story itself was placed ready for actual placement in the history books.